She stood barefoot on the porch of a dusty Wyoming ranch, her POW uniform frayed and sun-bleached, a chipped enamel cup of coffee trembling in her hands. The morning wind carried the scent of hay, tobacco, and frying eggs. A cowboy leaned against the railing, hat tilted back, boots crossed, watching the sunrise like it owed him something. Then he turned to the stunned Japanese woman beside him, once trained to believe Americans were devils in human skin, and said with a shrug, "She's not a prisoner to me." For decades, no one talked about what happened next. In 1945, thousands of Japanese women, many nurses, typists, and auxiliaries, were captured and shipped across the Pacific. But a small group ended up in places no one expected, deep in American ranch lands, farmhouses, and open plains. Instead of cold prison camps, they found cowboy coffee, cornbread, and horse stables. But beneath the kindness lay something even more dangerous, a mirror that shattered everything they'd been taught to believe. The truck rattled to a stop in a cloud of dust, the engine coughing before it died. For a moment, no one moved. Inside the canvas-covered bed, a group of Japanese women sat shoulder to shoulder, the scent of iron and sweat clinging to their uniforms. Weeks had passed since the surrender, but every bump on the road had felt like a descent into some unknown punishment. Haruka squeezed her hands in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. Then came the order, gentle, almost polite, to disembark. They stepped down one by one into blinding morning light. The air smelled not of smoke or blood, but hay, distant manure, and something else, something strange. Butter? Haruka blinked. Before her stretched not barbed wire or concrete barracks, but open plains, wood fences, grazing horses. A long, low building sat nearby, smoke curling lazily from a chimney. And in front of it stood men, not soldiers in helmets or bayonets, but broad-shouldered figures in dust-covered denim, leather boots, sun-darkened faces beneath cowboy hats tilted against the sun. No one shouted, no one jeered. One of the men, his shirt open at the collar, a blue bandana knotted around his neck, nodded once and said something in slow English none of the women understood. His voice held no venom, only weariness and routine. Haruka couldn't stop staring at his hat. It looked like something out of a film reel, something fictional. Her world had been mud and blood and steel. This looked like something built of stories and sunlight. The group was led across the yard. The dust rose around their ankles, warm against their skin. One woman whispered, "Is this a trap?" Another muttered, "Where are the dogs?" But there were only horses, standing in the shade, tails flicking at flies. Inside the building, part mess hall, part bunkhouse, the women were instructed to sit. Haruka lowered herself onto a wooden bench with hesitation. Her body, still braced for commands, barked in anger. Then the smell hit her. It came in waves, bacon, eggs, coffee, and something sweet, maybe bread or jam. Her stomach clenched so hard it hurt. One of the cowboys, still wearing his hat indoors, set down a tray in front of her. Real porcelain, real silverware. On the plate, scrambled eggs, thick-cut bacon, a biscuit dripping with golden syrup. A metal cup of coffee steamed beside it. She stared, frozen. She hadn't seen a meal like this since she was a teenager in Nagasaki, back when her father was still alive, back before ration cards and ash fell from the sky. The woman beside her sniffed her coffee, then began to weep. Another reached out to touch the biscuit as if it might vanish. Haruka's hands trembled. She picked up her fork, silver, not tin, and cut a piece of egg. It was fluffy, soft, warm. The first bite hit her like a blow. Salt and fat and memory. Her throat closed. She had prepared for many things: interrogation, starvation, even death, but not this, not kindness served on a plate. Across the room, one of the cowboys leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching them eat. He didn't smile, didn't speak, but his presence was calm, almost protective. When their eyes met, Haruka looked away quickly. The food sat in her mouth like guilt. She chewed slowly, swallowing shame and sustenance in equal measure. The silence around her was not tense, but reverent. Women ate without speaking, the scrape of forks, the clink of cups. One laughed, quickly stifled. No punishment came. Outside, the horses shifted. The air buzzed with flies and distant wind. Haruka set down her fork, hands still trembling. She had stepped into a world that looked nothing like a prison, and that terrified her more than any cell could. That night, Haruka lay stiff beneath a cotton blanket that smelled faintly of detergent and sun. The mattress creaked beneath her weight, real springs, not wood slats or straw. Her head rested on a pillow, soft and unfamiliar. The silence was almost unbearable. No bombs, no boots, only the faint murmur of wind moving through dry grass outside the window. And yet sleep would not come. Her mind reeled back to the oath she had whispered during her training, back when surrender meant shame deeper than death. Better to die with honor than live without it. They had said the Americans would laugh as they stripped you, sneer as they paraded your broken body through camps for sport. They had said you would be spat on, beaten, thrown into cages like animals. That death, if it came quickly, would be mercy. They had promised horror. Instead, she had been handed a plate. Haruka closed her eyes, but memory bloomed sharp and cruel. She remembered the final hours of the war, crouched in a medical tent outside Manila, the jungle closing in like a fist. The surrender had come not as an explosion, but as a whisper. An officer, face pale and jaw clenched, declaring the emperor had spoken. The war was over. They were to lay down arms, burn all papers, and prepare for capture. Some had tried to run. Others wept openly. A few slipped blades into their sleeves and walked into the trees, choosing death on their own terms. Haruka had frozen. Her hands, used to stitching wounds and cleaning blood, went numb. She had been trained to hold herself with pride, to serve without question. But as the American troops approached, uniforms clean and rifles pointed low, she had felt something crack inside. Not fear, exactly. Something worse. Doubt. The journey across the Pacific had blurred into salt spray and steel. The ship was gray, enormous and crowded, but not cruel. They were given rations, not much, but more than expected. Soup, bread, even tea. At night, Haruka listened to the ocean and waited for the deception to end. It never did. Now, in this strange corner of America, she could not shake the dissonance. After the meal, she had been given a change of clothes, simple cotton pants, a shirt, and a thin jacket. As she stepped out of the bathhouse, hair damp and legs trembling, one of the cowboys, the same man who'd watched them eat, had walked over. He didn't say much, just held out a red bandana and gestured to her head. "For the dust," he said, slow and neutral. She didn't understand the words, but the motion was clear. A gift, a gesture. She took it with both hands, as she had been taught, and bowed without thinking. He nodded once and walked off. The fabric was soft. Not military issue. It smelled faintly of soap and tobacco. She stared at it for a long time, unsure what to feel. It was just cloth. And yet, in that moment, it became something else. A symbol of how little she understood this enemy. The other women were equally stunned. In hushed voices behind bunkhouse doors, they asked each other if this was theater, some elaborate act before punishment began. One woman confessed she had hidden a spoon in her boot, prepared to use it as a weapon if needed. Now she used it to eat stew. Haruka sat on her bunk and turned the bandana over in her hands. It was red like the flag of her homeland, but it did not feel like shame. It felt like breath. Whatever this place was, it was not what the Emperor had promised, and that terrified her more than any battlefield ever had. The next morning began not with shouting or boots against concrete, but with the sound of a bell, soft, distant, almost lazy. Haruka blinked against the early light pouring through the slats of the bunkhouse. Outside, the wind stirred the prairie grass. Somewhere, a horse let out a slow, nasal exhale. She sat up slowly, half expecting to be punished for sleeping too long, but there was no voice barking orders, no command to stand at attention. Only the scent of frying onions, eggs, and something else she hadn't smelled in years. Coffee. By the time she stepped outside, a clipboard had been nailed to the bunkhouse wall with names and tasks scribbled in both English and Japanese. Haruka scanned the paper. Next to her name, someone had written a single word: kitchen. Others were assigned laundry, garden, or stables. At first they hesitated. Was this forced labor under another name? But no threats followed, no guards herding them. Just the expectation of routine, structure without cruelty. In the kitchen, the air was thick with steam, butter, and the scrape of spatulas on metal. An older woman from Kyoto was already at work, peeling potatoes with rhythmic efficiency. Haruka was handed an apron, starched, clean, and shown where to wash her hands. A woman in an American uniform, her hair tied back in a braid, gestured kindly toward a bowl of cracked eggs and mimed whisking. The rhythm of it came back slowly. Chop, stir, clean. A far cry from the field surgeries she had assisted during the war. No blood, no screams, just the clatter of pans and the occasional laugh from a cowboy who leaned against the doorframe, his thumbs tucked into his belt. No one shouted when the toast burned. No one struck her when she dropped a tin can. It was work, yes, but it was work that did not hurt. At breakfast, Haruka stood by the counter as trays were passed to the other women. Bacon again, scrambled eggs, warm biscuits with honey, and always, always that smell. Coffee. She had never tasted it before the camp. In Japan it was rare, a foreign indulgence. Here it was everywhere, as common as dust and denim. She watched as the Americans poured it black into thick ceramic mugs, then drank without flinching. That evening, as the kitchen emptied and the sky turned amber over the fields, Haruka sat on the back steps, apron in her lap, hands raw from washing. She was staring at the sky, empty of planes, when a shadow moved beside her. One of the cowboys, the one who had given her the red bandana, crouched and held out a tin cup. It was full of coffee, still steaming. He didn't speak, just nodded and left. Haruka held the cup like it might explode. The metal was warm, smooth against her fingers. She lifted it slowly to her lips. The taste hit her like a jolt, bitter, dark, and unfamiliar. She coughed once, then took another sip, this time slower. And then, without warning, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't understand it at first. It wasn't the taste. It wasn't even the kindness. It was the sheer normalcy of it, the silence, the fact that someone had thought she deserved something hot and real at the end of a long day. The coffee was real. And in that moment, so was she. She pressed the cup to her chest, feeling the heat through the tin. Around her, the horizon stretched wide and golden. She was still a prisoner, But for the first time since the surrender, she felt like a person, and that, somehow, was harder to accept than captivity. 2 days later, a folded stack of papers appeared on the mess hall table beside the breakfast trays. A cardboard box of yellow pencils sat next to it, their tips freshly sharpened. One of the guards tapped the paper with 2 fingers and said, slow and clear, "Write home." Then he stepped back, arms crossed, and waited. At first, no one moved. Haruka sat frozen on the bench, her half-eaten biscuit forgotten in her hand. The idea was too foreign to process. Writing home? It had been drilled into them that, once captured, they would vanish. No letters, no proof of life. Just a long silence across the sea, broken only by government notices stamped with shame. Some women exchanged glances. One whispered, "It's a test." Another shook her head slowly, eyes wide, as if afraid that hope alone might break her. Eventually, one woman stepped forward, then another. Haruka followed, her legs stiff beneath her. She took a sheet and a pencil, sat down at the far end of the table and stared at the empty lines. The paper looked too clean, too free. She held the pencil tightly, as though it might be snatched away. What could she say? She hadn't written to her family since the Philippines, not since she had tended the wounded in jungle heat, wrapping limbs that would never be saved. Her mother's last letter, smuggled to her through a supply officer, had said, "Do not let them take you. Die with dignity." Haruka had read it in the dark, heart pounding. Now, here she was, alive, fed, clothed, sitting in a dining hall with sunlight on her face and a pencil in her hand. She lowered her head and wrote slowly, hesitating after each word. "Mother, I am alive." She stared at the sentence for a long time. "I am not mistreated. They give us food. They gave me soap. They do not scream. I work in a kitchen. It is not forced. There is coffee. It is bitter." She paused again, unsure how to end it, then added, "I do not understand this war any more." That was the truth, the only truth she could find. Around her, the scratch of pencils filled the room like rain on a rooftop. Some women cried softly as they wrote. Others sat in silence, hands trembling. One crossed out every word she wrote, leaving nothing but a blur of graphite. Haruka folded her letter carefully, initials only, H.A., and placed it in the wooden box where the guard pointed. She felt as though she had just committed an act of betrayal. But what was she betraying? The lines between shame and survival blurred more each day. The camp was still fenced, still watched, and yet each small gesture, the coffee, the bandana, now the letter, chipped at the certainty she had once carried like armor. These weren't just permissions, they were disruptions. If her captors treated her with dignity, then what did that say about the world she had left behind? What did it say about everything she had believed? That night, Haruka sat outside the bunkhouse, letterless and exhausted. She could still feel the pencil in her fingers, still hear the guard's voice helping her spell alive, pointing gently at the syllables like a teacher. She hadn't sung in years, but as the wind rose across the prairie and the crickets hummed, she found herself humming an old lullaby, something from childhood, before uniforms and silence. No one stopped her. No one told her not to. And that frightened her most of all, because the enemy wasn't supposed to allow softness. The enemy wasn't supposed to teach you to feel human again. But here, surrounded by dust and quiet mercy, Haruka realized the war had moved inside her, and it would not be won with weapons. The flour sack slipped from her grasp in a sudden dry puff. She had tried to lift it alone, stubbornness maybe, or the quiet desire to prove something, and her balance gave out halfway through the turn. Her foot caught a patch of loose gravel, and she fell hard, her shoulder striking the ground with a dull thud. The wind left her lungs all at once, and for a moment she lay there, dazed, the bright sky spinning above her like a carousel. Before the others could rush forward, a shadow moved beside her. A hand reached down, rough, sun-browned, calloused. The cowboy, the same one who had given her the red bandana, the same one who didn't speak unless necessary, the same one who had once shrugged and said, clear and quiet, "She's not a prisoner to me." Haruka stared at his hand. Then, slowly, she took it. The pull was gentle, not rushed, not forceful, just strong enough to steady her. He didn't ask if she was all right, not in words, but his eyes scanned her quickly, noting the dust on her palms, the slight tear in her sleeve. Then he turned, walked a few steps, and came back with a tin cup of water. He handed it to her and tipped his hat slightly, the barest nod, before walking off. The women around her murmured, some in surprise, some with poorly masked curiosity. One of them whispered, "Did you see that?" Another raised an eyebrow, smirking slightly, the implication unspoken. Haruka said nothing. She drank the water, still breathing hard, the cool metal of the cup pressing into her lip like a question she didn't know how to answer. That night, after dinner, she found something resting on her bunk. Small, metal. She lifted it carefully. A harmonica. There was no note, no explanation, just the instrument itself, scuffed but functional, as if it had lived a long life in someone's pocket. She ran her fingers over the smooth metal casing, the tiny engraved letters dulled with age. She hadn't touched an instrument since childhood. Music had been discouraged in the camps back home, too frivolous, too human. She sat down slowly, harmonica in hand, and felt the strange heat of recognition settle in her chest. Not romance, not longing, something stranger. Someone had seen her fall, and chosen to answer it not with discipline, not with ridicule, but with kindness. A kind that asked for nothing in return. It confused her more than cruelty ever could. She turned the harmonica over and over in her hand, unsure what to make of the gesture. It was a gift, but also a mirror, because to accept it was to admit that the lines were blurred now, that kindness had crossed a boundary she had once believed impenetrable. It wasn't just about falling. It was about being seen, not as an enemy or a duty, but as a woman, as someone who could hurt and heal. "She's not a prisoner to me." She heard the words again in her mind, and they landed heavier now than the sack of flour ever had. What did it mean to not be a prisoner in the eyes of someone who held the power to make you one? The others teased her lightly, nudged her ribs in passing, some with genuine warmth, others with skepticism. One woman muttered that the Americans were soft, like spoiled milk in the sun. Another simply said, "Be careful, even sugar can rot." But Haruka said nothing. That night, beneath the hum of prairie wind and the soft creak of bunk beds, she lifted the harmonica to her lips and played one uncertain note. It wasn't music, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that frightened her more than silence ever had. The nights came gently in the Midwest. The sun dipped low behind the plains, painting the sky in orange and lavender until it finally dissolved into a soft, endless indigo. A few of the cowboys would gather near the wooden fence after dinner, where the grass wore the scorched circle of many fires past. The flames crackled, modest and calm, and a guitar would appear, old, its varnish dulled by use and weather. The man who played it had a low voice and didn't sing often, but when he did, it was with a sort of reverence, like every note was something he'd borrowed from the dirt beneath him. Haruka sat with the others on the edge of the light, her hands clasped in her lap. No one had told them they could join. but no one had told them they couldn't. The first time she heard the melody, something fluttered inside her chest. It was nothing she recognized, just a slow, aching tune that climbed and fell like a memory someone forgot to bury. There were no words, only chords that stretched like open roads, like questions no one wanted to ask in daylight. The women leaned in closer each evening, their bodies warmer with proximity, their minds colder with confusion. One woman, Yumi, who had once trained with Haruka in the southern camps, sat cross-legged near the edge of the firelight. Her hair had grown out, and she twirled a blade of dry grass between her fingers. After a long silence, she spoke, not loudly, but just loud enough to be heard. "What if they were never monsters?" she asked. No one answered. The crackle of the fire filled the silence, but the question didn't go away. It lingered, sharp as a blade hidden in a fold of cloth. For weeks, they'd carried the belief that everything they were witnessing, the food, the music, the cowboy who handed out harmonicas, was deception, a trick. But the trick never ended. The guards didn't strike. The food didn't rot. The smiles didn't fade. Slowly, unbearably, the doubt crept in. If the enemy treated you like a person, what did that make your hatred? And if surrender brought safety, what did that make the fight? Haruka couldn't answer Yumi's question. Not then. Not even later, when they lay side by side on the bunkhouse floor and listened to the guitar in the distance. But she felt it crack something open, not like a wound, like a doorway, and still the guilt sat heavy. She could not shake the image of her mother back in Nagasaki, face pale under the weight of war, her body hunched over a ration line. Her brother, too, enlisted too young, sent too far, likely never to return. Haruka remembered the smell of burned rice, the way hunger thinned people into ghosts. Now here she was, belly full of bacon and beans, knees warmed by firelight. She felt the shame curl inside her like smoke. Comfort was not peace, not when it came wrapped in enemy uniforms and unexpected songs. She looked up at the stars, clearer here than she had ever seen, and wondered what they looked like above her homeland. Did her mother see them through bomb smoke and tears? Did she think her daughter was dead? Would she hate her for surviving like this? For laughing, even once, beside a man in a cowboy hat? Haruka pressed her hands to her face. She didn't cry, but the heat in her chest was harder to hold than any pain she had ever known. The guitar played on, slow and steady. No one spoke again that night, but the silence was not empty. It was full of quiet questions no one yet had the courage to answer. By late March, the wind shifted. It still blew dry and wide across the plains, but it carried something new, the faint scent of green things waking beneath the dust. The cracked earth outside the bunkhouses began to soften. Tiny shoots of wild grass crept along the base of the fence, and purple petals bloomed stubbornly between coils of barbed wire. Spring had come to the camp, quiet and uninvited. Haruka noticed it first one morning while sweeping the steps. A single yellow flower had appeared just beyond the edge of the guard tower's shadow. It leaned slightly, wind-blown and stubborn. She stared at it for several minutes, unable to move, as if the flower might vanish if she blinked. It didn't. It simply existed, unafraid of where it had taken root. The transformation wasn't just in the land. The camp began to breathe differently. Men's jackets were traded for rolled-up sleeves. Chickens returned to the yard behind the mess hall, their clucking rhythmic and familiar. Even the guards' postures loosened, as if the cold had kept their suspicion stiff, and the warmth now pulled it gently from their bones. In the far corner of the compound, beside a long disused tool shed, someone had started a garden. It was a humble thing, a rectangle of tilled dirt bordered by loose stones. At first it looked accidental, just disturbed soil, but soon careful rows emerged. Carrots, beans, a stubborn squash vine, the work of hands that remembered how to coax life from tired land. Haruka learned it was Sato, another nurse, who had begun it. Quiet and broad-shouldered, Sato rarely spoke unless necessary. But her hands moved with knowledge, with memory. She invited Haruka to help without words, merely passing her a small trowel one afternoon and pointing to the soft earth. Haruka knelt and began to dig. By the end of the week, she had her own row. She planted herbs, basil, shiso, things she wasn't sure would grow in this foreign soil. She didn't care. She just needed the act, the repetition of pressing seed into dirt, the feeling of soil beneath her fingernails. It gave her something the lectures and letters could not, proof that something broken could begin again. One morning, Sato handed her a small bundle, cloth-wrapped, tied with string. Inside, a pair of gardening gloves, thin, canvas, slightly worn. Haruka froze. For a moment she couldn't speak. Her throat tightened, and heat rushed behind her eyes. She clutched the gloves to her chest and turned away, hiding her face from the others, not out of shame, but out of something stranger, the pain of being seen. No one mocked her. No one asked why she wept. She wore the gloves each morning, and every morning, as she stepped across the yard, past the fence, past the watchful but now unfocused eyes of the guards, she felt something inside her stretch. It wasn't freedom, not really. The wire still coiled around the perimeter, the gate still locked. But something had shifted. The wire no longer felt like a cage, it felt like a border, a thin line between two worlds, one known, one in question, and that line, once so thick with fear, now trembled with possibility. Others began to ask Sato for seeds. Someone painted rocks to mark each crop. A woman started collecting rainwater in a rusted tub. There was even talk, quiet, almost embarrassed, about what they'd do with the vegetables once they were grown. It was the strangest feeling of all. Agency. And it scared Haruka more than surrender ever had. Because if she could shape a garden in a prison, what else might she reshape? And what then would remain of who she had once been? The horse was old, gray around the muzzle, slower than the others, with a calmness in its eyes that suggested it had seen more than it cared to remember. It stood still as stone beside the paddock, reins looped loosely over the rail, chewing patiently on nothing at all. Haruka had passed it a dozen times before, but this time one of the cowboys, the same one who had offered her water that day she fell, gestured toward the saddle and said, in a voice low and even, "Want to try?" At first she thought she had misunderstood. Then she looked again and saw no jest in his eyes, just quiet invitation. Haruka's first instinct was to decline. She was a prisoner, wasn't she? Prisoners did not ride horses. They did not feel the sun against their back from the saddle of something so free, so uncontained. But then she looked at the animal. Not a symbol, not a test, just a living creature. And she found her feet moving forward. The cowboy gave no lecture, no instructions, just a steady hand and a nod. When she climbed onto the saddle, her posture was rigid, like a porcelain doll placed too upright. Her hands trembled on the reins. But the horse didn't flinch. It stepped slowly forward, then out toward the clearing beyond the paddock, beyond the bunkhouses and latrines, and even the faint echo of the flagpole clinking in the breeze. She rode past the fence line, not across it, never that, but close enough to see where the wire ended and the sky began. For a moment she forgot to be afraid. She wasn't a nurse, she wasn't a prisoner, She wasn't even Japanese or American or any name the war had pressed into her skin. She was just a woman on a horse, moving through warm wind and prairie dust, hearing only the soft rhythm of hooves and breath. Her breath, the horse's breath, nothing else. And that terrified her. Because survival was one thing, clinging, enduring, obeying. But this was something else. This was choosing, enjoying, letting go. It felt like betrayal, and yet it also felt like healing. She didn't know which scared her more. By the time she returned to the fence, the other women had gathered to watch. Some smiled, some looked away. Sato gave a subtle nod. Yumi laughed, short and surprised, as if the sight of Haruka on horseback had tilted the world just slightly off axis. Later that evening, Haruka sat by the bunkhouse window, hands still dusted with sweat and dirt from the rains. She stared out at the horizon and tried to piece herself back together. What was she now? A prisoner who gardened? A woman who played harmonica? A survivor who rode horses? Or was she a guest? That word haunted her, not because it was false, but because it might be true. She remembered how she had once trained to resist capture with silence and poison. She remembered how the fear of American hands had kept her up at night in the jungle, and now those same hands had offered her a saddle, a harmonica, a pair of gloves. Was it kindness? Or was it the enemy's greatest weapon? Mercy that made you doubt your hate. Inside her, a fracture deepened, because the more she tasted of this strange, quiet life, the more impossible it became to hate her captors without hating herself. And that was a war she had not been trained to win. If you've made it this far, and this story has moved you, hit the like button and tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to hear your story, too. It came in the early light, with no warning and no ceremony. A clipboard passed from officer to officer, lists read aloud in clipped tones, and then confirmation. The war was over. The women were going home. No cheers followed, no spontaneous weeping, just a slow, stunned silence. It wasn't the kind of homecoming anyone had imagined, because now home had become a word too complicated to say out loud. Haruka stood beside her bunk, looking at the bundle she had prepared. Not much. A folded shirt, her canvas gardening gloves, the harmonica wrapped in a scrap of towel, and tucked beneath them all, a red bandana, faded and soft, smelling faintly of flour and hay. She had meant to return it to the cowboy who gave it to her, but something inside her refused to let it go. Last, she added the letter, the one she had written months ago but never sent, the one that began, "I am not mistreated. I do not understand." She read it again now and felt like it had been written by someone else, someone more innocent, or perhaps just more afraid. She folded it slowly and placed it at the bottom of her bundle. Outside, the sun was rising, not warm yet, but full of promise. The wildflowers along the fence had grown taller. Some brushed the wire now, others bloomed defiantly on either side. The women gathered quietly near the gates. There was no farewell ceremony, no gifts exchanged, only glances, tight grips on shoulders, and unspoken questions too fragile to voice. One woman, eyes wide with confusion, asked what many of them were thinking. How do we explain this? How do you explain being treated with dignity while your country burned? How do you speak of gentle guards and horse rides and songs under starlight, when your father starved, your neighbors died, and your homeland was bombed into dust? There was no language for that. Haruka stood still, watching the barracks, the garden, the paddock. She heard chickens squabble somewhere in the distance and the soft clink of metal from the kitchen. Life went on, indifferent to departure. A few guards stood off to the side, not in ranks, not imposing, just watching. One of them lifted a hand slightly as Haruka passed. She met his eyes, nodded once, then looked away before she could feel more than her body could carry. On the transport bus, she sat beside Yumi. Neither spoke for the first hour. The engine growled, the tires hummed over dry earth, and the prairie wind chased them like a memory trying to catch up. Then, finally, Yumi whispered, "I don't want to forget this." Haruka didn't answer right away. She pressed her fingers against the bundle in her lap. "We won't," she said, "but we won't be believed either." Because how could anyone believe that the deepest transformation she had undergone was not in war, but in a camp built by the enemy? That she had arrived expecting monsters and instead found something else, something more dangerous than cruelty, kindness that left a mark. As the gates vanished behind them, she felt the ache settle. Not regret, not longing, just the hollow weight of change without a place to put it. She looked out the window as the prairie passed by, wide and unblinking. A land she would never call home, but that had changed her nonetheless. She had come here afraid to die. Now she left unsure how to live. Years passed, not loudly, not ceremoniously, but like dust settling on windowsills. Tokyo rebuilt itself in layers of concrete and neon, of train whistles and crowded sidewalks where people moved fast, eyes forward, as if speed alone could erase memory. Haruka moved among them quietly. She worked. She stood in lines. She bowed when required and smiled when expected. She became just another woman in a city learning how to breathe again. And yet she carried Wyoming inside her. On a cool autumn afternoon, as she walked through a narrow market street near Ueno, the air thick with the smell of grilled fish and roasted chestnuts, something stopped her. Not a voice, not a sign, a sound, soft, metallic, a melody wavering through the crowd like a thread pulled loose from time, a harmonica. She turned slowly, her hand rising instinctively to her chest. There, between a fruit vendor and a newspaper stand, stood a street musician, thin, older, his hair silver where it met his hat. The harmonica rested against his lips, and the tune drifting out was unmistakable. The same lonely, wandering notes she had heard beside a campfire thousands of miles away, played on a prairie that still lived only in her memory. Her fingers trembled. She hadn't realized until that moment how carefully she had folded that part of herself away. The people around her paid the musician little attention. Some tossed coins, others walked past without looking. To them it was just another foreign melody threading through an afternoon. But to Haruka it was a key turning in a lock she had never dared to touch again. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It had curled at the edges over the years. In it, a pale horse stood beside a wooden fence, and beside the horse, wearing a red bandana, stood a younger version of herself, eyes unsure, posture stiff, but alive in a way she no longer allowed herself to be. She never showed that photo to anyone. There had never been room in post-war Japan for stories like hers. The country had suffered. Atomic ash still haunted the streets. Families had starved. Cities had burned. There was no place for a woman to stand up and say that the enemy had treated her with gentleness, that they had handed her gloves and music and hot coffee on cold evenings. So she stayed silent. When neighbors spoke of the Americans with bitterness, she kept her head low. When co-workers repeated old slogans or cursed the war, she let the words pass over her like rain over stone. They needed their version of truth. She did not have the heart to fracture it. But sometimes when she passed a small cafe and caught the aroma of roasted beans drifting through an open door, she froze mid-step. because the smell was never just coffee. It was steam rising from a tin cup on a wooden stair. It was a prairie wind brushing her cheek. It was the echo of a voice saying, not cruelly, not politically, but simply, "She's not a prisoner to me." And he had been right, not because she had been free, but because for the first time she had been seen, not as a uniform, not as a nation, not as a symbol, but as a person. She never told the full story, not to her husband, who barely spoke of the war himself, not to her children, who only knew their mother as quiet and distant, not to the women who shared rations and sorrows with her in apartment stairwells. Some stories, she learned, are not meant to be understood by everyone. Some are simply carried. As the harmonica song faded and the musician packed away his instrument, Haruka placed a coin in his open case. He nodded politely, paid no special notice. He could not know the weight he had just lifted from her chest. She walked on, but the tune followed her all the way home. If this journey resonated with you, don't forget to like the video and comment below. Where are you watching from, and how did this story make you feel?